Welcome. It's just gone 7 p.m. Wednesday, the 26th of May, and you are watching episode 8 of Regional Wrap. Regional Wrap, providing an insight to the issues affecting regional Australia and giving a voice to regional residents. My name is Bill Bates, and joining me on this episode are my guests Tim Quilty and David Landini. Tim is the MLC for Northern Victoria, and David is the founder and president of the Riverina State Party. Welcome, gentlemen. If I can start with you, Tim, can you just give us a bit of a rundown on your past history and also a little bit about the party, Liberal Democrats?
Yep. So I'm from a, I'll just get through that thing on my screen. So I'm originally a farmer from southern New South Wales. My parents got a sheep and cattle farm there. I did that for a number of years before we had a fallout over succession planning, and I went off to become an accountant instead, which then led to me moving from Wagga down to Wodonga. I've lived in Wodonga now for about 10 years or so. Working as an accountant, most recently working for the tax office there in Albury. And I got elected to Wodonga Council in 2016. So I joined the Liberal Democrats political party back in 2003, I think it was. So just shortly after the party got started. And Liberal Democrats are small government, low taxes, personal freedom party, libertarian party, or classical liberal. We had a senator elected in New South Wales, David Leyonhjelm. We had a upper house MP in WA until the last election, where everything got wiped out. And we have a couple of upper house MPs here in Victoria, and also a scattering of councillors around the place. So I joined that party quite some time ago, and we just had the party's 20-year anniversary a couple of weeks ago in Canberra. And I ran in a number of elections, federal elections for the party, but knowing I wasn't ever going to win anything anywhere. So I ran in 2004, 2007, 2010, and 2016 federal elections. But coming straight after federal election in 2016 was a council election in Wodonga, and I ran for that. And somewhat to my surprise, I was elected to council as a representative of the Liberal Democrats. And I was there for a couple of years on council, and then this position opened up for the Victorian State Upper House, and I ran for the party for it, and again, somewhat to my surprise, I was elected. So, and now I've been a MP for probably coming up close to 3 years now in the Victorian Parliament, which is quite a change in life. So, yes, does that cover the question?
I'll just jump in there for our audience, because we're coming from Cairns. MLC is a member of the Legislative Council, and in Queensland we only have one house, that's the Legislative Assembly, but most other states, including Victoria and New South Wales, well, all the other states have two houses, and that's what we're missing out on. We lost our upper house in 1922, 1923. So we've been a unicameral parliament in Queensland since 1923. You're also a border jumper, Tim. You jumped over to South Australia and did your studies, I see.
No, not South Australia.
No, they've got a campus.
So there's a campus in Wagga. I originally studied in Sydney, but then didn't finish that degree, and then years later I went back and studied in Wagga. So, but yeah, so originally from New South Wales, and that's possibly where part of the idea of a combined state from regional New South Wales and regional Victoria comes from. I'm not very passionate about Melbourne. Yeah.
Okay, we'll cast over to David and give us a bit of a rundown on your history and the Riverina State Party.
Yeah, thanks very much, Bill. I'm self-employed. I run my own wool broking business. I deal with farmers all the time. They're the major source of my work and my income. And I'm based in southern New South Wales in the Riverina, of course. But like a lot of Riverina businesses, all of our export destination or export trade goes through Melbourne. And I actually sell wool in the Melbourne wool sales. Southern New South Wales, where I am, it's a 3-hour drive to Melbourne, and it's an 8-hour drive to Sydney. This area, the people in this area are actually in New South Wales, of course, but much more Victorian orientated, certainly commercially, and I would say culturally. Australian rules football is the game here. For example, the sport that's played. The Herald Sun is the major paper that's read, and Carlton United Breweries is the most popular beer. And also, a lot of the original settlers, when they came into this area, came up through Victoria, through Geelong, Melbourne, through the goldfields, over the river into the Riverina. Sydney is really a different state. It's a different. It's certainly not as close as Melbourne in any of those areas. So, like Tim said before, Tim doesn't have much feeling for Melbourne, and I agree with Tim on that point, but I also don't have much feeling for Sydney either, because Sydney's just another place. It's a foreign town, to be quite frank, compared to Melbourne. People here are from this area right through up to, I would say, Wagga, and even slightly past Wagga, are actually more Victorian orientated, culturally and commercially. So it's not a big thing to sort of want to separate from Sydney, because our business, our lives, we don't have much connection with Sydney anyway.
Well, if I just jump in there, the Riverina has had a past history of separation attempts, going back pre-colonial days, and then especially again around in the 1920s. And like New England's been on and off through the 50s. And then after the New England lost its referendum in 67, I think. Yeah, 67, 29th is April. Things sort of went on the back burner. But Tim, I'm sort of interested in your sort of focus on separate state in regards to, well, there's not really much history in Victoria about separation because you're only that big to start with.
Yeah, that's probably true.
Sorry, Tim.
But well, maybe because I come from Southern New South Wales to start with, it was more of a thing for me. It's all, and certainly when I move around in Victoria talking about it, it's a surprising idea for a lot of people, but it's an idea that I think makes sense. If you live outside of the city, and the further you are away from Melbourne, the easier a sell it is to tell people about it, and they say, "Oh, actually, that makes a whole lot of sense." So the idea may not have been there before, but it's certainly there now. When I first raised the idea, I talked in my maiden speech in Parliament. I talked about Rexit, a regional exit. It was partly as a joke, not a joke, but it was partly used humorously, saying, if you don't take it seriously, this is what will happen. But after 3 years sitting here and watching how the state works, it's not a joke at all. I absolutely think, that's the bells ringing in the background, that it has to happen. So it is going to happen. No one's joking anymore.
In regard to that, I think COVID's played a part in sort of pushing this idea a bit forward, because I think, if anything, like in Queensland, which is second to Western Australia for population and size sort of thing, we in the north, we've had no real transmission of COVID, yet we were sort of had to go through masks, and we also had sort of lockdown in different areas at the early stages and that. And the one size fits all mantra from the state capitals seems to give everyone's the irrits in regards to they can't differentiate between regions, especially when there's no COVID out in the regional areas, and it's really confined to the major centres. Fair enough, if they want to locked down and close their put an iron circle around Melbourne, Sydney, and Brisbane. That's fine, but it was quite pointless making people social distance and lock down and all that in places like Mount Isa, which is, way out west, and you couldn't get much further. You're almost in the NT. So, and I suppose a lot of people in regional New South Wales and regional Victoria probably felt the same way, that the one policy fits all was a bit of a problem.
Yeah, David, do you want to take
Bill,
that?
Sorry, Tim. Yeah.
You go. Yeah.
Well, Bill, I don't think the COVID issue has been the reason for the need for a Riverina state. Certainly the rules that are made in Sydney that don't really apply to us, they are irritating, there's no doubt about that, but that's certainly not the major reason, sorry. But to go back to the history of Riverina separatism, the first real attempt to separate the Riverina from New South Wales was in the colonial days, and that was back in 1863, the first very, very serious attempt to separate from New South Wales. Now, Victoria, of course, separated from New South Wales as a colony in 1851. Queensland, I think it was 1859, and the Riverina attempted to separate in 1863. So there was a real movement among the regional areas way back then to separate from New South Wales, because all of Australia to the West Australian border was originally New South Wales. So that was the first major attempt, and that went for about a 10-year period, and there was various petitions sent to the Parliament of New South Wales and to Queen Victoria. There was a delegation sent to the Parliament of New South Wales. The delegation was even sent to England to see Queen Victoria personally, and then came back. That's how serious they were. It was a very big attempt, a very big effort. And if you read the original petition, a lot of the points that they raised back then are still relevant now. And one of the very interesting points that they raised back then, they pointed out that in the Riverina, to get to Sydney, they had to go south down to Melbourne via boat or horseback or walk, catch a boat in Melbourne, sail around the coast to get to Sydney. And they just pointed out that that's, it's really not practical to be governed by Sydney when you had to go via Victoria to get to Sydney. And that was one of the points they made. Another point was the irrigation system. The people way back in 1863 could see really great potential for irrigation in the Riverina. The Riverina is largely a natural floodplain, a large part of it. And the government of New South Wales did not show any interest in that great potential, and that was another reason why they wanted to separate. There were a number of reasons, but those reasons were raised back in 1863, and they're still relevant now. And then, of course, that was not agreed to. The Queen Victoria and her advisors referred the matter back to the Parliament. I'm not sure if it was a Parliament back then. They were colonies back then, but they referred the issue back to the colony of New South Wales, and the government at the time decided not to separate the Riverina from New South Wales, possibly because they thought that Victoria had only separated in 1851, Queensland 1859. They might have felt a bit of a threat, perhaps. But just a slight digression, but a very interesting point about Victoria. Victoria separated from New South Wales. The final separation occurred on the 30th of June 1851, and extremely coincidentally, gold was discovered on the 1st of July in Victoria in 1851, one day after the state was separated from New South Wales. I thought that's extremely coincidental, but I actually suspect there was a bit of insider trading going on there. And I suspect that New South Wales got duped significantly, because I'm really sure that Victoria would not have been allowed to separate with the great wealth of gold that was discovered that came out of Victoria after that. So I'm pretty sure they kept that secret. So that was a very interesting thing that I found out just as a part of this issue. But unfortunately, they didn't. New South Wales didn't agree to the Riverina separating, and it just died down over time. But it was certainly a very, very, very big issue. And then, of course, Bill, as you raised before, from the 1920s to the 1930s, there was another very, very huge push to separate the Riverina from New South Wales again. A lot of that was caused by the Depression, low wheat prices, low farm prices, but also the Jack Lang Labor government in New South Wales. It was considered to be a very, very bad government and a very, very poor governing body. And there was a real attempt to separate them, based in Wagga, centred in Wagga. Charles Hardy Jr. was the main man. But they had what's called the Great Riverbank Meeting. I can't recall the exact year. I think it was 1930, around 1930, but there was 10,000 people in Wagga attended that meeting. And the next week they had another meeting in Narandra, which is not far from Wagga, and there was another 5,000 people attended that meeting. And they were very, 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 very upset with the governance in New South Wales. Unfortunately, in my opinion, the effort didn't go down the right path. It deviated into the wilderness, I think, and it failed as well. And of course, World War II started in 1939, and that sort of put an end to all that there. But there always has been some separatist movement in the Riverina from New South Wales.
I think it's just a natural progression anyway, as people sort of become a little bit independent and develop their own regions throughout history. And Queensland had a fairly similar situation. As you said, we got it became a separate colony in 1859, and it was only 22 years after that, in 1871, that the first petition from central Queensland went over to Queen Victoria seeking separation from Brisbane. That failed because it was probably a little bit too early, and I mean, there was probably only about 10,000 people in north of Brisbane at that time. But the most serious attempt was in 1890. Then it came out of centralised in Rockhampton, and they got a petition, and there was over 7,000 signatures. Now, 7,000 signatures, the whole population of the central Queensland at that time was only about 40-odd thousand. And if you think in those days, only males over 21 had the right to vote. So they are also the only ones who could sign the petition. So 7,000 males over the age of 21 signing that petition is pretty well a full complement of the population of that time. And if you read that, and the same I think you would find on your petition, as you said on your petition, David, read the petition, and there's the problem that they had is exactly the problem we have today. And they even use the same sort of language that they're overwhelmed in Parliament by the members from the Southern Division. At that time, they referred to the Southern Division, Central Division, and Northern Division, which is basically Southern Queensland, Central Queensland, and North Queensland. So way back in those times, they identified that problem, and they also highlighted the wealth that was generated in the regions completely outstripped that within the southern section around Brisbane and that whole corridor, simply because at that stage agriculture was the big thing, and there was great exports both in cattle and wool, and there was also the start of mining and gold in North Queensland and things like that. So it was pumping up the economy of Queensland quite well. So they had those histories tracked fairly well in those colonial days. But as for COVID, I was just trying to refer to in Victoria's instance, because it hasn't had that history. I was just wondering, Tim, if COVID is sort of put the conversation up a little bit in Victoria.
I think it's definitely supercharged it. COVID and so lockdowns and also border closures have really made an impact in the region, because COVID was almost nowhere in regional Victoria do we have COVID cases. Certainly almost nowhere in northern Victoria were there any of them. Yet we had the same rules imposed on us as they had in Melbourne for months and months. And every time they just do a lockdown, so far they've just done the whole state because it was easier. And they didn't care. They could have easily done something different, but they couldn't be bothered, which is the same story. That's how the government runs in Victoria. It's always Melbourne, and they don't care about anything else. But also the border closures really drove home to people on the border how intertwined our local economies are, how much we need each other across the river, and how we don't need Melbourne. Also, we don't need them to such a big extent. On the first day that New South Wales closed the border to Victoria, back in whenever it was, there were 10,000 people that couldn't get to work just in and around Albury-Wodonga. There were businesses that were shut, schools, teachers, hospitals. Literally the whole workforce crosses the border every day in both directions. And that was just snap imposed on us after Gladys had been saying, oh, we'll never close the border, we won't do that. And then bang, she did it. And without really a thought what it would mean for us, because they just don't think about what's happening in the region. So certainly there's still a huge amount of anger about that out there. And I think that's supercharging the debate. It's why it's such an easy sell for me now, pushing the message.
The other thing that happened too is from those colonial eras of petitioning Queen Victoria for trying to get separation of the colonies or new colonies, we went to federation, and it's quite interesting. I think the history of attempted separations by New England, the Riverina, Central and North Queensland was a catalyst for making sure it was also incorporated into the Constitution. So our forefathers had the wisdom to put a whole chapter in there in regards to allowing separation of territories from the states to create new states. Section 121, 22, 23 and 24. The only problem, I'm not sure whether were having a lend of us, but one thing they sort of did is they put the actual initiation of the process in the hands of the state parliament of the territory that wanted to leave. And to me, that seems like it was like going to mum and ask, you want extra allowance, and she's got complete control, or you want to go out. And they're just not held to it. So there's no interest whatsoever from the major parties or the seat of power to get this across the line. So is that one of the weak points in regards to our constitution, in regards to creation of new states, that the way it's been framed in Chapter 6?
No, I don't think so, Bill. Look, when Australia was federated, the states drew up the constitution, and they thought, look, it's very, very likely that in the future new states will be formed. So they put in the constitution the process for a new state to be formed. And section 121 to 124 are the relevant sections of the constitution. And section 124 is the specific section, and it states that the only requirement to form a new state is the consent of the parliament of the existing state. That's not I don't think that's I don't think that's too high a hurdle to get over. And I think it's quite reasonable. And I think it's actually the only way it could be done, because you can't really have a group of people declaring that they are seceding from a state by themselves. And you can't really, I don't think you can have the federal government, well, the federal government never would declare that a group of people can secede from a state anyway. So I'm very pleased that that's in the Constitution. I thought that they had a significant amount of foresight there. And of course, the Constitution was drawn up and formalised in 1901. I mean, Victoria only separated 49 years beforehand, Queensland only 40 years beforehand. So it was all still fresh in their minds. So I'm actually quite pleased with that bill, and I think it's quite reasonable, and I don't think it's too high a hurdle to get over either.
My point is that while our original system, even if you go to the 1930s and before the two-party system really came to the fore after the 50s, you had in the 1930s, you had genuine interest by the states, especially New South Wales, to create additional states. And they had the Cohen Commission in the late 20s that had a look at the different areas within New South Wales that were suitable for separation as new states.
Yeah.
And they identified New England, they identified the Riverina, and they also basically Eden and Monero were the three that got a bit of a tick. They followed that up in the 30s with Nichols Commission in regards to working out the criteria for a separate state. And that, I think, if you look at the Nichols Royal Commission results, it sort of looked at things like don't use borders, don't use rivers as borders, because usually on rivers there's one side of towns on one side of the river and the other side of towns on the other. So you're dividing communities. So one of its recommendations that you don't divide communities, use areas that are sparsely populated. And I think they also sort of recommended maybe tops of mountain ranges and things like that were a fair sort of divide. They also looked at one of the points were water source was an issue. They didn't want people to be disconnected from water source. But that may have been okay in those days, but now we've got better agreements between states in regards to water courses anyway. But there was a fear at sometimes, like I think when you looked at the New England example, when Baskin looked at the proposition when he was forced to give the people in New England a referendum, he was coerced by the then Country Party, which was the junior partner. It did hold, I think, about 16 or 17 seats. So it was a fairly big junior partner at that time. And he jumped onto the Nichols report, and because Newcastle got its water through the New England basin there, he added Newcastle and even down to Lake Macquarie into their border situation. So all those ballot boxes came into play in Newcastle and Maitland and Lake Macquarie, and they're the ballot boxes that lost them that referendum. So, in fairness, David, yes, our forefathers were right with what in the Constitution, and even our former politicians back in the 20s and 30s were genuinely looking at the problem. But now that we've moved to where we've got two solid major parties who are just, dominate the parliaments in the state parliaments, is we need, the only way to break the situation is to have a minor party, and I presume that's what you're looking at, to get that bounce of power. So when it goes into a situation, when a new parliament's formed, they've got the bounce of power, and that's one of the points they can negotiate in the future. And that's the same sort of situation we're looking in Queensland. Is we've had a history of only governments other than the Newman government for the last, since we came back to one man, one vote, or one vote, one value after the Fitzgerald inquiry. We've only had one parliament where there was a majority more than 7. And in many instances, we've had majorities as low at around about the 2, and sometimes we've had hung parliaments, but what's happened is that the negotiation usually put someone in the speaker's seat, gave them that ability to pass budget bills and financial bills. So that's the area I think most people like yourself in Riverina State Party and other minor parties interested in a separate state, that's the direction they've got to go. Do you think that's right?
Yeah, I do think that, Bill. I'd just like to go back to the New England attempt back in the 1930s to 1967. That was a really that was a very, very credible attempt to form another state. And of course, I think New England, if you look at where it is, it's actually much closer to Brisbane and Queensland than it is to Sydney. And I'd say, I would actually think that a lot of those people there wanted to separate from New South Wales because they're actually more Brisbane orientated anyway, simply because they're a lot closer to Brisbane. But I think the New England effort was very, very good. They did everything right. They, of course, lobbied for a referendum in the New England area. They had a defined area for New England, and that was decided in the Nicholas Royal Commission. It included Newcastle, which in hindsight was that lost the referendum for them. But they did have a referendum in 1967, and they only failed by, and I'll just go back, sorry, the referendum was only in New England. It wasn't the whole of New South Wales, and I think that was exactly what has to be done eventually in the Riverina. But the referendum in the northern areas, it was up around 65 to 70% of the vote said, yep, let's separate. But because Newcastle was the major city, and the 2/3 of the Newcastle vote went to stay in New South Wales, they lost the referendum 46% to 54%. But in that time as well, Robert Askin, he insisted that Newcastle be included in the referendum because it was in the Nicholas Royal Commission. But he also knew that if Newcastle was included, they would most likely vote to stay in New South Wales, and that's what happened. But there was also some threats made by Sydney and New South Wales to the dairy farmers in the Newcastle area, and they implied that if you separate, we may not take your milk anymore into Sydney. Now that was a very significant threat to the livelihoods of those people, and that caused a lot of them to vote not to separate because they were really frightened about that. Of course, Section 92 of the Australian Constitution forbids any barriers to trade in Australia, so it was an empty threat. But the threat was made, a lot of people believed it, and that also helped the vote to go the New South Wales way. But the referendum up in northern areas was, up around 65 to 70%. So ultimately, the New England people set the pathway. Ultimately, there really does have to be a referendum. You have to have something that will cause the Parliament of New South Wales and Victoria to consent to the separation of those areas to form another state. So to get that consent, practically, I think it does require a referendum, as the New England people did. What happens is that when we have a referendum, we make sure that we're going to win it. The area that want to stay in
have
Sydney,
the questions framed so you got to win it.
Well, have the question framed so you're going to win it. But also, now just for an example, this is only an example, but say Dubbo, for example, was included in the Riverina, and we knew that Dubbo, the majority of people in Dubbo didn't want to separate from New South Wales. Well, I would say, well, we'll just leave Dubbo out, and we'll draw the boundary somewhere else. So the first thing,
I was going to say,
sorry,
well, the same in Victoria. If Ballarat doesn't want to come in, for example, then you leave them out. That's it. That's fine.
That's right.
Leave them out of the referendum, but we don't need them.
Leave them out of the referendum. They don't want to be part of it, so don't include them. So that's the one thing. If you look at the New England effort, I mean, they did everything right, except they got bluffed on that on allowing Newcastle to be in there. So we have to, in any future referendums, and there does have to be a referendum, not of the whole state, just the Riverina or just the people in that proposed new state area. But that area won't include any if there are any areas that don't want to be part of it, and we'll just make sure we win that referendum. And that referendum. Sorry, Bill.
I'll just finish off, David.
So that referendum, a successful referendum, as in the New England effort, a successful referendum will actually compel the Parliament of New South Wales to consent to the formation of that new state. It will go to the Parliament. They really won't have any choice. They will have to consent to the formation of that state.
Granting of the referendum is basically consenting to separation, provided the referendums won. That's the general position. But in regards to New England, I mean, we had the New England New State movement was operating in the before Federation in the 20s. The Depression and World War II, it went out of vogue. It came back stronger in about 1950. By 1953, it was up and running very strongly. Working through to 65, I think they around about in the 60s they raised £100,000 in one of their fundraisers. A big focus they had I think there was a guy called Thompson. His first name escapes me, but he was a newspaper person. I think he eventually went to Parliament, but he rounded up a group of newspapers. So in those days they were all independent in all the country towns, and I think there was about 130. Victor Thompson was his name. He organised through those newspapers to really push the issue. And the other thing is, New England New State movement had great influence on the then Country Party. Basically, if you wanted to run for the Country Party in northern regional New South Wales, if you didn't support separation, there was no way you were going to get endorsed, and no one was going to. Basically, they were all going to take you to task. So it was the New England's movement's influence on the Country Party that delivered them that referendum. If it wasn't their influence, it didn't matter a damn about their all their town meetings and their rallies and their petitions. They amounted to naught. It came down to had the influence with the then Country Party to say and it was an agreement before the 65 election between Page and Askin. If they won the 65 election, then the people of New England would get their referendum. And they won that election and they were in power for the first time in 41 years. So in regards to your party, Tim, I can't really see your party having a new state policy.
So the Brexit New State thing, it's not officially a party policy. It's certainly a platform that I've been running on. We went to the National Conference a few weeks ago, and I actually had an opportunity to sell it to the delegates there. But having said that, the idea of decentralisation and devolution of power is part of our libertarian platform. So it's not a thing the party doesn't support, but it's certainly not a plank of the party platform as such. But it's absolutely my platform. One of the reasons I want to do this is to create a state where we have more freedom, a chance to have a new state, a chance to rewrite a constitution, to include a Bill of Rights in the constitution, limiting the government's power to interfere in our lives. So that's one of my driving reasons behind me wanting to do it. I can't see us ever getting freedom while we're attached to the big city, whereas in the regional areas there are still people who like the idea of freedom. So that's definitely a driver for me. But we don't necessarily need it to be Liberal Democrats who get elected. We just need candidates who will be elected, who will support it from these areas. And it could be the National Party, although they don't seem enthusiastic at the moment. But it could also be shooters, farmers, fishers, or independents. Just needs to be a commitment to it.
Normally, the National Party should be the home for separate state sort of thing. So I presume they're sort of, well, actually, I think they've been a little bit disconnected from the regional voters over the years. But I mean, in Queensland, we don't have a National Party anymore. We amalgamated with the Liberals back in about 2008. And I think the nearest MP member of Parliament is down in the Burdekin, and they're pretty few and far between in central and north Queensland. So is that basically why because you couldn't find political support from existing Party. Was that the need or the catalyst for you to look in coming up with the Riverina State Party yourself and pushing it as a party?
Yeah, Bill, I was actually a member of the National Party for about 10 years. I quit the party probably 4 or 5 years ago. I'm not quite sure, it'll be somewhere around that period of time. But the National Party...
was that because of the greyhound racing or the amalgamations?
There was a number of issues there. I just realised that the National Party and I differ on a lot of points. I'm extremely disappointed with the National Party. That's to be kind. So no, we parted our way. But there's a lot of things. The National Party has been a very popular party in the past. I think that popularity is falling away very, very rapidly. But if you tried to work through within the National Party or even the Shooters, Fishers and Farmers Party to try and make this a party policy to form a separate state, I think it would be impossible. It just wouldn't happen. You could spend, I or anybody else could spend another 10 years trying to get that up, but I don't think it would be accepted in the National Party. The National Party, I think they're very, very closely tied to the Liberal Party. Far too closely tied to the Liberal Party. I think they're more closely tied to the Liberal Party than they are to their own constituents, to be quite frank. There's a number of
tied to the ministries and the jobs, yeah.
Well, exactly right. The Liberal Party's bought the National Party out with ministries. The National Party, you form coalition government, you get the deputy premiership, you get any number of ministries that you want, and those politicians pick up another 100,000 a year on top of that. I think they used to be on $160,000 a year, and the ministry ranges between 120 to another 90,000 on top of their other little lurks and perks as well. So the Liberal Party's worked the National Party out. The National Party have gone along very, very well. It's a very, very cosy relationship. And as I said before, I think the National Party values their coalition with the Liberal Party more than it values their own constituents. And they're losing seats. I think more and more people realise that. It's something that sticks out a mile. And I think more and more...
And they also get number two seat on the Senate ticket as well.
In the upper house, yeah, they get on the number 2, 5, some deal with the Liberal Party as well. I mean, the National Party members of Parliament do really well out of being in coalition with the Liberal Party. And I'll just repeat again, I think they treat that much more importantly than they do the wants and the needs of their constituents. And their actions prove it. You've only got to look at the water issue. You know, it's a huge, huge issue in the Riverina and northern Victoria. And the National Party have, in my opinion, have just totally abandoned their constituents on that, because they have to, for the Liberal Party to win seats in the urban areas, they have to cater for that Green vote. There's a lot more Green voters in New South Wales than National Party voters in New South Wales. But if the Liberals want to form government, they have to cater to that Green vote. And if the National Party wants to be to have so many ministries in the coalition, it has to cater to what the Liberal Party wants. And the Liberal Party wants the Green agenda to take place as far as water goes. And we've got a disaster in this area at the moment, particularly with water. But there's not only water, there's all other natural resource-based industries. The urban areas are shutting these industries down. And the National Party, they give lip service, they say things that they think people want to hear, but that's about it. But their actions prove that they are not on their constituent side. So,
if I just get onto the urban and country divide sort of thing, in regards to we've got up here, we've guys basically got the Labor and the LNP are the major parties that are going to have the power. We've got the Catters with a few seats and that. But do you think it's possible for a Sydney-based party or a Melbourne-based party or a Brisbane-based party to write policy that to win the voters in the capital cities, in those where there's about 70 odd seats, and write policy that's in the best interest of people in the regions and their needs. Is it possible, or just? I think it's completely impossible.
Yeah, you're right. It's completely
not possible.
It's completely out of the question, and we've seen the results of that over the last 50 years or more. As power concentrates in the city, that just more and more they're doing things that are not in the interest of the people in the regional areas. We're now at the point where literally the regions don't matter at all in the electoral calculation. So, yeah, under the current system, we're screwed, and it cannot be fixed.
I agree entirely with Tim. Yeah, I agree entirely, Tim. The regional areas are not considered at all by the city, the bulk of the city voters, and it can't be fixed. It's reached a point where it's gone over the cliff. It can't be recovered. It actually cannot be fixed within the current system, and the only way is to simply because we just don't have the numbers. It doesn't matter what our one member of parliament in 93 does, or in New South Wales there's only 8 members of parliament west of the Great Dividing Range. It doesn't matter what they want or say or do, even if you had any that were actually on your side. But it doesn't matter. They go to the Parliament in New South Wales with 93 members in the Legislative Assembly, and they can say and do whatever they like, but it doesn't make any difference. And we can't change it. The numbers just aren't there, and it doesn't matter what you do or how you twist it around or bounce it or bend it. That it can't be changed. And like Tim said, it actually can't be fixed within the system. New South Wales.
I talk about the cities have become effectively a black hole, and it's just sucking everything out. And we've crossed an event horizon where you can't get back under this system. There's no way back from here, other than separation.
No, there's not.
Can you think of any bit of legislation that's come out of the capital cities in the last 5 or 10 years that has been a boom or a benefit to people on the land? Because I struggle in Queensland between every bit of legislation comes out. It's the Vegetation Management Act. It's a big blunt instrument over the farmers. The reef regulations, another big blunt instrument over. Are you aware of any legislation that's come out in the last, say, 10 years that's made life easier for people on the land?
No, nothing in Victoria. To be fair, Victoria's had a Labor government for most of that time, which is very, 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 very even more focused on Melbourne than the coalition. But even in New South Wales, it seems doubtful to me.
I think it's now probably time to share some of those slides you had up before in regards to inbounce between the cities and the regional in regards to actual representation currently and the direction it's heading. So
let me put one up first, and then we'll throw to David. So let's see how the share the screen works. Where are we? I'm going to peer around one monitor to the other one. Here, share. Is that working? Yep.
Not yet.
Not really. It looks good from my end.
No, it hasn't come up. You haven't shared it.
Maybe David should go first. Hang on. Oh, did I not hear? Normally I have staffers to help me do the whole screen thing.
Okay, David.
I can bring up the New South Wales one. I won't venture into Victoria. I'll just discuss New South Wales.
Yep.
Is that right?
Yeah, go for it.
So I've just got to.
Yeah, it's coming.
Can you see that?
It's about to share. It's loading. There it is. So you've got 71 seats around that.
Tim?
Yep. That's right.
Yep. Newcastle, Sydney, Wollongong area. Yep. And 22
that's
in
New
the rest
South
of the
Wales.
state. That's New South Wales. Yep. They're the seats in the legislative assembly.
Isn't that the joke in New South Wales? That New South Wales means Newcastle, Sydney, and Wollongong, and that's it. The rest of you, it's just the backyard.
The N actually does stand for Newcastle. The S does stand for Sydney, and the W does stand for Wollongong. There's no doubt about it. Yep. So, will I take that map down now, Bill? Have we seen that long enough?
If you've got another one to share, you put one about the electrics
well,
on the west side.
That map there, that just shows the concentration of electorates in the urban area, and that's bad, as we can all see. I mean, it's concerning straight away, but that's not a static situation either, because there's a set number of electorates, there's a set at 93, and and they're based on equal population, and because the population growth is mainly in the urban area, the country areas of New South Wales lose one electorate and one member of parliament on average every 5 years. So every second election, in effect, there's one less electorate in the country, one less member of parliament in the country, and our effect continues to go down. So I'll just show you another map. Now there's only 8 electorates west of the Great Dividing Range as it is, and the country areas lose one electorate every 5 years. Now it's quite possible that in 40 years there'll only be one electorate and only one member of parliament in the Legislative Assembly from that area there west of the Great Dividing Range.
You haven't shared yet. You haven't brought it up.
I haven't shared that.
No.
I thought that should have actually come up. Pardon me. I'll just
double click on it.
I double clicked it. Oh, yeah, sorry, Bill. I didn't click the sorry, my mistake.
Okay.
Sorry.
Yeah, it's coming up now.
That's better.
There it is.
Yep. Now, if New South Wales continues to lose one member of parliament every 5 years, and there's only 8 electorates west of the Great Dividing Range, now it's possible that in 40 years' time, that will be one electorate. There'll be one member of parliament from that entire area in the Parliament of New South Wales. Now, we can all obviously say that that's not fair. That's not democracy in any way, shape or form. And some people might say, well, it'll never happen anyway. But that's based on the trend of the last 115 years. If the trend from the last 115 years continues, beg pardon?
You can take it down now.
Take it down?
Yep.
If that trend continues, we will only have, it's quite possible in 40 years, there'll only be one member of parliament west of the Great Dividing Range. Practically, there might be 2, maybe 3, but it's quite possible that there'll only be 1. So we obviously, by that stage, will have effectively no representation in parliament. Now the problem is, and just to go back to what Tim said before, where you can't in New South Wales, we want more seats in the country, and we want you to have less in the city. Well, all the people in the city and the parliamentarians would say, well, no, that's not democratic. You can't do that. They wouldn't accept it. So they won't accept that. They won't accept in any other situation than what we'll end up with, and we can't accept the situation. So they can't accept it. We can't accept it. And it just means that we have to part company. We have to separate.
In Victoria, Tim, have you noticed the same sort of situation? Because I'm quite aware of the New South Wales situation and the Queensland situation, but I'm not across Victoria.
Yeah, it's exactly the same story. The electorates in the regional area disappear and they move to the city. Victoria, for the Victorian Upper House, the state's divided up into 8 regions, 5 in the city and 3 in the regions. But now Melbourne's grown so big it's overflowing into the regional regions, so that 5 electorates in Eastern Victoria and Western Victoria are actually Greater Melbourne electorates. So they're basically swallowing up even that representation for the regions. The city is now 77% of the voters. I'll have another go at sharing this screen. See what I'm doing wrong. Got to hit share. We got it?
It's coming.
Yes.
That's it.
Excellent. And let me push the other button.
That's it.
Yep.
Yeah.
All right. So there's the graph of the electorates. Basically, they're all in Melbourne, and you can see on the other side is the map of Melbourne and the rest of and all of Victoria. This map is because Labor had a landslide election at the last election. You can see there's probably a bit more red than there would be on an average year. But you can see there's also a really stark difference between the way people vote in the city which is Labor and Greens, and the way they vote in the regional areas, which is mostly Liberal, National Party, and the light blue areas are independents, and you'll see especially along the river, the National Party are being rolled out of their seats and replaced by independents because the National Party have lost touch with the voters. So that's pretty much shows you the problem, but it also shows you a solution. For example, if we have a Labor government in Melbourne and the Rexiters or the New Slate people go to them and say, we're going to take away all these areas that don't vote Labor in the regions from you, and you can be in government in Melbourne forever, that's actually a pretty compelling argument for Dan Andrews there. So that's an incentive for him to say, yes, you can go, you can bugger off. You were talking before about how hard it is to get the state parliament to vote for it, but if we sell it right, we find the right marketing angle, we can get the parliaments to support it. You could take that same argument to the National Party and say, here's an area you can be the premier, you can be the government if you actually talk to your voters, and that's a compelling argument for the National Party. You can go to Canberra and talk, if the coalition's in government, and say, here's a whole new state. You'll get 12 new senators in a conservative voting area, and that's going to change the balance of power in Canberra. That's a compelling argument for the federal government. So finding the right political argument can make this thing happen. But yeah, anyway, I'll take that off again now.
If I can just look at show you the Queensland situation at the moment, if you take that down too. I think one of the starkest things is in 2017 we had a redistribution, and part of that redistribution, originally it was stated that Queensland would stay with the 89 seat parliament, and the redistribution we would have lost 2 seats in central and north Queensland, and they would have been transferred basically to southeast Queensland. All good marks to Robbie Katter. He convinced them to increase the size of the parliament to 93, and so what happened is 4 seats were created in southeast Queensland, basically 2, one north of Brisbane River, one south of Brisbane River, one on the Gold Coast and one on the Sunshine Coast, and we maintained our 17 seats in central and north Queensland. We're now faced in 2024 with another redistribution, and the population spread doesn't bode well. So I'll share this screen with you. All right. All right. This is the regional Queensland, regional Victoria, regional New South Wales. You're feeling overwhelmed? Well, this is a situation 5 years comparison from the last census in 2016. This is a 5-year period from 17 to 2020. The population of Queensland's increased by 331,000. 312,000 of those were in southeast Queensland, and we in central, north, and southwest Queensland, all the rest of the regional areas, we got 18,000. That basically means they're getting 17 people for every one of increase in central or regional Queensland in general. That does not bode well when we go to the next redistribution, because a reasonable amount of those will transfer into the number of voters in each of those areas. So it's going to be interesting to see how we fare come that redistribution, and I doubt whether we're going to be able to hold all our seats in central or north Queensland in particular. So that's a really frightening prospect. And the other scary thing is, to get us out of our bind with the economy after COVID hit, I am sure the Commonwealth government is going to open the floodgates when international borders open to migration, and we're just going to get a boatload of people into this country, and they're all going to flock to the major cities and make our situation only worse.
Yeah, just on that, Bill, with you said Robbie Katter recognised that problem, and the Queensland Parliament created, was it? I think you said three or four new seats in Queensland.
Yep.
Yeah, and those new seats would have all been in the southeast part there, around the Brisbane area.
That's it.
And that enabled the country areas to keep their 17 seats, and that's good in one way. But as a proportion of the representation in the Parliament, that you still would have had a significant decline in the representation, as in the country areas sat at 17, whereas the city area picked up another 4. So your proportion of the representation actually declined significantly, and it doesn't
understand
matter.
I understand that. But the thing is, it's like everything. Because of the vast distance, it's probably better at least we have more members than less members, even though the proportion's still in bounce.
Yeah.
But the thing is, I mean, as it is, we've got the same problem in New South Wales. I think it's your seat, Barwon, but we've got Kennedy, we've got we've got Leichhardt. No, we've got in the state election we've got Cook, Prager, Gregory, and Warrego. They're the large area seats, and they cover a lot more area than a couple of Victorias. So they're the situation we've got there. And we're just declining representation is the problem. I mean, we've had people fight for separate state under the guise of not getting our fair share and all this sort of stuff, but that should never be the primary thing. I think it's all about representation. You can whinge about your fair share and things like that, but the only thing that's going to remedy the whole problem is representation and your own state, basically. So you don't even have to think about Melbourne, Sydney, or Brisbane and what the latte set there want. You're just governing for your situation.
Yeah, I agree, Bill. And just in New South Wales example, there's one seat named Barwon, which you mentioned before. Now, Barwon takes up 43% of the entire area of New South Wales. One seat, 43% of the area. And that's one member of Parliament for 43% of the area of New South Wales. I mean, that's you have in effect no representation. But if you go back to the 1904 electoral map, that area of Barwon actually in 1904 contained 6 electorates and 6 members of Parliament back in 1904, and now there's 1. So that's Barwon, for example. In Murray, where I am, slightly south of there used to be 2 members of Parliament in the same area. Now there's 1. Albury used to be 2. Now there's 1, and that's happened over the whole area of the state. All the country electorates have got bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, and in the city area, basically smaller and smaller and smaller. It used to be about half and half city, half country, and now it's 3/4 city, 1/4 country. 76% Newcastle, Sydney, Wollongong, and the other 26%, 36%, whatever it is, in the country. It's basically no representation at all. In effect, there's no representation. You can have a member of Parliament can go to Parliament, make a really good speech, and say all the proper things, but when it comes to a vote, the numbers simply aren't there. It doesn't matter what you say or whatever, the numbers simply aren't there. And the laws and the regulations, whatever else that come into power, they're made in the city. And in the city, they have very different economic and financial interests to us in the country. The country is mainly primary industry orientated. The city, they're certainly not. Oh, they are in a secondary way, but not in a primary way. But there's also a huge green influence in the city. There's more green voters in New South Wales, mainly in Newcastle, Sydney, Wollongong, and up on the north coast. There's more green voters in New South Wales than the total number of voters west of the Great Dividing Range. Now, I think everyone in the country would say, well, that is disastrous, and it is too. And if you look at the water situation, we've got at federal level, the Murray-Darling Basin Plan, or the Murray-Darling Basin Authority and the Murray-Darling Basin Plan, and that's a federal legislation and a federal bureaucracy. But New South Wales signs up to the Murray-Darling Basin Plan every year. because of course water is a state responsibility. That's in the Australian Constitution, Section 100. So as New South Wales and Victoria and South Australia sign up to the Murray-Darling Basin Plan every year. Now, that's disastrous for this area. And unfortunately, I think a lot of the blame around here gets directed at the Murray-Darling Basin Authority because they're the most obvious target. But it's a bit like the matador and the bull. The bull charges the matador's flag, hits the flag but misses the matador. And it's much, I think it's very, very similar with the country areas and the Murray-Darling Basin Authority. People here criticise the Murray-Darling Basin Authority, but that's only the flag, that's only the cape. The matador is actually the New South Wales government that signs up to the Murray-Darling Basin Plan every year. New South Wales can withdraw, and Victoria can withdraw from the Basin Plan anytime they want, and they don't. And that's just one of the disastrous pieces of legislation and governance that comes out of Newcastle, Sydney and Wollongong. And to be quite frank, we have to separate. We have to get away from that. It's really to the point of life and death to some degree. It has to be done. We have to get away from them. We're just far too different.
Tim?
Yeah, it's the same story in Victoria. We've had the Melbourne government shut down the native timber industry in Victoria. That's devastating those communities that rely on timber. They're not going to do anything for the environment. We're going to import timber from rainforests in Indonesia and overseas to replace the sustainably harvested timber from our very sustainable industry. So globally, the environment gets worse. In regional Victoria, economies are devastated. People walk away, towns die. But votes are bought in Melbourne, and that's all that matters. The Murray-Darling Basin is the same story. They're doing things. They don't care that what they're doing is actually damaging the river, doing environmental destruction. It sounds good. It sounds like they've got environmental water. They're actually destroying forests with their environmental water, but it's environmental water. It sounds good to the Melbourne voters. You can't. We've already said it. Can't fix it. It's the Green vote in Melbourne is worth more than all the votes in regional Victoria, and without separation, they're happy to watch regional Victoria die. I've heard that the government, their plan for regional Victoria is to serve coffees to people from Melbourne who come out from the weekend. That's their job, the tourism industry. And I'm not attacking tourism, but literally they want timber workers, they want miners, they want farmers to retrain to make coffee to serve to people from Melbourne. It's not the future for our kids that we want.
Okay, we've gone past 8 o'clock, so we'll sort of move on to wrap up. But we're in Queensland, we've got a fairly good idea through past history where we want borders and what we look at it as a separate state. And I presume you two, David, have got a fairly good handle on that, but from previous history. But one of the things that have changed in regards to where people thought borders could be is what state governments now have to deliver as services and that. So there are some sort of critical criteria that you sort of need to have in place to make a viable state. Like, I mean, in the colonial days when people thought, oh, it was just central Queensland would be one colony and northern Queensland be another colony, even though they only had 50,000 people or that, it wasn't that daunting because state government didn't have to build out all these hospitals, and they didn't have to put out a big police force, and they didn't have to put a big education system out there. So it's now, if you're going to have a separate state, you would have to look at at least some primary things that you must have. You must have a reasonable sort of population base to generate a revenue. You must also have some natural resources and earning potential for economy. So I think people in New South Wales and Queensland have got a bit of a handle on that. Tim, for Victoria, how do you think parts of Victoria become a separate state, or do you think you will have to look at merging with some areas across the border in southern New South Wales along the Murray River to become new states rather than just a separate state within Victoria? Because the Constitution does allow for territories of separate states to to form new states as well. But it's got to be somewhat more of a difficult task because you've got to get two state governments to agree to let you go.
So my original, very first map I drew, I picked up the whole Murray-Darling Basin. So that was most of Victoria, most of New South Wales, and also a chunk of Queensland and South Australia.
Oh, you're greedy.
Because we pick up the water, it solved, put all the water problems under one single state, and that would solve the Murray-Darling Basin problem, or go a long way to addressing it. But as you mentioned, the more states you include, the harder the thing gets. So maps I've drawn since then, I've left out Queensland and South Australia, and included various parts of New South Wales and Victoria. It could be just the Murray Basin, so northern Victoria and southern New South Wales, or it could go all the way up into northwestern New South Wales as well. It could the New South Wales part could very well overlap with David's map of Riverina State. And how far we go in Victoria is, I guess, open to who wants to come in. I keep getting messages from people in Gippsland in Eastern Victoria saying, you can't leave us behind. Please don't leave us behind. We've got Western Victoria. It makes some sense to get access to the ocean and Portland, the much neglected port there, but on the railway lines is a very good port. So I eventually what I'd say is I'm not setting where the end of the boundaries are. What I'd like to get is northern Victoria and southern New South Wales, and then whoever else wants to come in.
What about you, David? You got an overview?
Oh no, I'd agree with what Tim said there for sure. Yep, northern Victoria, Riverina, very, very similar areas, culturally similar, commercially similar. The history of the people is similar, same ancestry, all that sort of thing. Very, very, the similarities are all there, and the economics, they're all there. So that would be the case. And as Tim said, I wouldn't necessarily restrict it to that area. I mean, I'm open to whoever else wants to join. They're most welcome to join. Gippsland, for example, the timber industry in Gippsland is being gutted by the Dan Andrews government. Very, very, very influenced by the Green vote. If I was in Gippsland, I'd want to get out of Victoria too. And if I was in the Western District, I'd want to get out of Victoria too. Quite frank. I think there's a lot of potential. We've all got the same problem. So I wouldn't limit it to one area. Certainly a base area, but I wouldn't just limit it and say that's it either. So no, I agree with Tim entirely.
Okay, I'll just share a screen of my vision. What I've done there, I've got all the states wrapped in, and you can see the number ones. That's for the new state of North Queensland, and then for your Riverina or whatever is just a whole section running from southwest Queensland right down to Victoria, with the Portland as the exit port. And basically, I think that's really the whole inflow of the Murray-Darling Basin, and that's the connectivity. And number threes is the old New England area, but they also sit in and eat some of the southwest Queensland as well, not southeast Queensland, but the country area there. So they do have a natural history, like you said before. Northern New South Wales, southern Queensland, they did have a cross-border relationship. And then good old Eden-Mamero and your Gippsland area over here at number 4. But I haven't left out West Australia either, because they're a powerhouse amongst themselves with iron ore and that. I'm sure we could centre a new capital in Geraldton or something like that, and that could be another state as well. So that's a long-term vision.
I do think, just looking at WA, pretty much everyone living outside of Perth hates Perth. We often hear a lot about how West Australia wants to separate from the eastern states, but it's actually Perth wants to separate from the eastern states and take the rest of their state with them. I think I don't know, there's a strong movement for separation in West Australia, but there's certainly potential there. They have the same problems as we do. And the south west part of West Australia has got the exactly the same issues. They don't want to be part of Perth. They want to be separate.
I think they've now got Waxit is a group, and that's actually looking back into the situation of actually leaving the federation, like they did in the 1930s when they had a referendum there, and that referendum was won, but the technicality of the fact that we still had to appeal to the British Parliament to get it ticked was knocked back by the British government.
I think you'll find though that's a vote from Perth. In the regions, they're not. Either they're not part of that, or if they could easily be convinced to not be part of that and to have their own breakaway area for pretty much. In WA, you could easily draw a line around Perth and make the whole West Australia another state.
I think that's the view of a lot of people, is just put a big fence around the greater southeast Queensland, New South Wales. It's basically Newcastle, Sydney, and Wollongong, and then greater Melbourne area, and then the rest of us be happy.
Yeah. Sounds perfect.
Okay, gentlemen, it's gone 8:15. It's been a good night. I hope you enjoyed the Zoomcast. It's a pleasure to have you on. Is there any final comments, Tim?
I don't know. A lot of people I talk to say this sounds great, but it's never going to happen, is it? But it's actually much easier than we think. It's just if we can build the support for in the regions, we can easily persuade the parliaments. We can make the vote happen. It's not something that's going to happen 20 years down the track or 30 years down the track. We can make it happen in 3 years or 4 years or 5 years. It's just a matter of getting serious about it, building support for it, and then going to the state parliaments and saying, we want this to happen now. We'll have a referendum, show that we support it, and it can happen. It will happen, and it must happen.
David?
Yeah, look, it will happen because it has to happen. It's simply that. There's a lot of detail around that, but it has to happen. Therefore, it will happen. We will separate from Newcastle, Sydney, and Wollongong. There will be a separate state, simply because it has to happen. It will.
Okay, gentlemen, we'll wrap it up there. If you just stay with us, I'll just wind up the show and just provide a bit of information about next week's show. Thank you, gentlemen. That was episode 8. Next week on Regional Wrap, episode 9, I'll be joined by David Calcico and Neil Green from the Queensland Seafood Industry Association, which currently all our fishermen are under great pressure with the government reviewing quotas for catches. It's already difficult enough to make a living with the current quotas, but they're looking at a further reduction of 17% in the catch, which will make it virtually impossible for any of our fishermen to make a living. And we will see what's happening in the industry, and we'll be told from those in the industry how it is affecting them and what their future is. So join me again next week. This is Bill Bates, host of Regional Wrap. Good night.